a reaction associated with weathering. You can solve these equations. You can model them, as scientists have done for many, many decades. And you look at the time scale here associated with these chemical reactions, and the answer is 1 million years. So ocean acidification is buffered by weathering, and the feedback response time is on the order of 1 million years. So in summary, then, this inorganic carbon cycle couples this huge reservoir, 10 to the 8th gigatons of carbon, with atmospheric carbon through these various mechanisms. And it's a very robust mechanism. It's been working for a long time. The kinetics are slow, 100,000 years or more. So now let's look at the summary of these reservoirs and exchange rates and go back to them. And these are the various exchange rates that you see, and you recognize the slowest ones. This particular one is on the order of 100 years. This one is on the order of 1,000 years. This one is on the order of 10 to the 5th, 10 to the 3rd, 10 to the 5th years. And these deep ocean subductions on the greater than 10 to the 5th year. So there you have it, my friends. The diurnal cycle, trees growing. The annual cycle, summer and winter happening. Thermohaline circulation contributes to CO2 modulations. And then over here you have the geological processes. So each of the peaks now are accounted for in our variance spectrum for CO2 in the atmosphere. So where do you and I fit into this? Well, we've been pumping CO2 in the atmosphere with great vigor, really for about 100 years. And if you look at the change in CO2 concentration, that's our peak right there. So it gives you a sense for what humankind has done in the scale of geological processes, the human perturbation. So here's our current carbon cycle in a slightly different graphic, showing, for example, geological reservoirs, coal, natural gas, oil, pumps CO2 into the atmosphere at these particular rates. The oceans take it up, the lands take it up. We change the way we use land, and these are the numbers for this decade and this decade, and you can see, for example, how much they're going up. Let's compare that to pre-human times. Okay, here's our emissions. Pre-human times, the volcanic emissions were less than 1/10 of a gigaton per year, and the uptake by the oceans was less than a gigaton a year. So to be blunt, we have introduced something at rates that are unseen in geological time. Volcanoes match this number historically, and we're at 100 times the rate of all the volcanoes, just you and I, for our emissions. So, but really, to a geologist, 1 million years is, yeah, it's just a small attribute. And so whatever we do to the atmosphere, whatever, on these time scales, on the order of 1 million years, all the changes that we've introduced into the atmosphere will be accommodated by this huge carbon reservoir in the center of the Earth. And that seems like a nice idea. So we make some predictions, just like the ones we saw before, and now we can be more accurate about these predictions because we have some sense for the time scales associated with CO2 being taken up. So let's do a simulation. You and I have already emitted 500 gigatons of carbon, and let's add a little more. We decide to burn moderately because we're environmentally conscious and we use renewables, or we just continue to burn everything we can dig up out of the ground. And so what you have here now is here's the gigatons of carbon per year emitted as a function of year. Here's where we burn everything, business as usual, and here's this very progressive way to think about things. So that's what goes into the atmosphere. So what happens to that? Well, the first thing that might happen is that it's taken up as dissolved CO2 in the oceans and then CO2 in the deep ocean. So the first thing that happens is this ocean invasion. There's a decay right there associated with CO2. And here's the years here. Notice the scale. But of course, this assumes that the CO2 uptake from solution has infinite capacity. It certainly doesn't. They're not infinitely large. They don't have that capacity. So we have to modify that. So here's our perturbation right here. Here's some of the CO2 taken up by the ocean. There is some reaction from weathering to form calcium carbonate, and there is some reaction with the igneous rocks. Notice the time scale here. just as I said. Okay, so that's 1,000 gigatons per year total emissions. Here's what the CO2 looks like in some reasonable time scale. CO2, we're at 400 right now. That's where we were before we decided to burn. 700 ppm is where we get to right away. An ice-free Earth is at about 620 ppm. So in the 1,000 gigaton total emissions, we have an ice-free Earth for quite a period of time, for 100 or 200 years. Let's do it again with 5,000 gigatons. That is, we don't do anything. We just burn it as we dig it up. So look at the scale has jumped quite a bit over here. Here's where the CO2 concentrations will be. Here's an ice-free Earth. And at least for the next 8,000 to 10,000 years, we have an ice-free Earth. So on shorter time scales, on 100,000 or a million years, the consequences of our emissions now can be more accurately predicted because we know how much CO2 has been taken up by the oceans and the rocks. So I'm going to close today with an experiment. So everything I've talked to you today is about really models and processes of which we know a little bit about. Wouldn't it be great if we could do an experiment and measure all the data from the planet Earth in response to a big bolus of CO2 into the atmosphere? It turns out the Earth has run this experiment, and it's one of the most exciting aspects of climate science. So tree rings are a proxy of temperature, and the ratio of certain isotopes also tells us about temperature. So we can use decayed trees and shells in the bottom of the ocean to get measurements, temperature and carbon dioxide concentration. And so let's go into the past. Here's the atmospheric concentration as a function of time. This is millions of years before the present. Okay? So way back in time, 400 million years ago, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was really quite large, somewhere between 1,500 and 7,000 ppm. A lot of uncertainty here because, of course, there isn't a lot of data. And then 300 million years ago, we had a really extreme ice age. Yeah. So this blue bar represents the presence of ice sheets on the planet Earth. And then we were warm again. And then, you know, we're here on this little delta function way over here, where our current CO2 concentration. So let's blow up this region, this first, 60 million years ago. So here we are today. The ice sheets are still present. And here's a measure of temperature, proxy for temperature. Ooh, what's this? What's this right here? See this little peak? Something happened 55 million years ago in which the temperature shot up. That's the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And it's this, here's a blow up of that graph. And it represents a very significant event in Earth's history. Here's a measure of the isotopes of carbon-13. And you see there's this nice peak here. The isotopes measure basically carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as coming from carbon in the Earth. It was estimated that about 1 to 2,000 gigatons of carbon appeared in the atmosphere. We'll say more as to why that happened in a few minutes. And this happened on the order of 4,000 years. So let's take a look at what the data say. So these data tell us that a massive amount of carbon-13 depleted carbon was introduced into the atmosphere. That means it came from the carbons. Here's temperature, an increase in temperature of about 6 degrees C, and you see that it lasts for on the order of 100,000 years. Let's take a look at the shells. Here's the amount of calcium carbonate in the ocean. Look what happens. It almost completely disappears in this event. That is to say, the oceans were so acidic that the shelled animals ceased to exist. And the recovery took 100,000 years. If anything, my friends, this is a measure of what can happen to the planet Earth as a result of us. In 100,000 years, we'll be fine. Let's take a look. What is the origin of this particular event? And it is believed, and then an area of very dramatic study, what was going on. And it is believed that this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum happened when there was a carbon tipping point. There were gradually increasing greenhouse gas levels. Something happened. The permafrost thawed, that is the peats that are in the northern parts of the planet, and they released an enormous amount of carbon, and the CO2 concentrations rose dramatically. I saw a paper in Nature just a few weeks ago in which the authors argued that the triggering event was a meteorite impact in the northern hemisphere. I saw another paper in which the argument was a volcanic eruption occurred that was the triggering point. Obviously, we need to study this a great deal more, but it's also a warning to us, is that once the temperature rises to the point where carbon stored in the near surface, as in peats and permafrost, once that thaws, we have an irreversible bolus of CO2 into the atmosphere that's at least as big as what we've contributed as a result of our combustion. 6 degrees C warming. Here's what the world looked like 55 million years ago at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Now, a warning, because of plate tectonics and continental drift, the continents aren't quite in the right place. Okay? A warning. But just take a look at the average temperatures that were present on the planet at those times. By average, I mean the average of day and night over the whole year. So let's see. The average temperature in this part of the world in the present area is 21 degrees C. Okay? So look at the average temperatures at the poles. There are certain parts of the world, particularly in the eastern Pacific, which are virtually uninhabitable when the average temperature is this particular temperature. And let's now take a look at what's left of India and other parts of Asia as a result of the fact that the sea levels are so much higher, A, because there's no ice left, and B, because the water is warmer. And I think you can see, for example, that significant parts of this world would be underwater. The entire eastern seaboard of the United States and the state of Florida is gone. Much of Europe is underwater. So the Earth ran this experiment, and now you know what the results would be. So the planet has seen these concentrations, and we need to wait 100,000 years for the rocks, oceans, and volcanoes to regulate that cycle. Burning all our coals will have a similar effect as the PETM. That means just our burning, not any things that happen. And the average temperature in this part of the world would rise to 27 degrees C. More if, in fact, these carbons released from permafrost are included into the calculation. So this is a good time to end this particular hour and just plea with you that the Earth needs your help. And we're going to start talking then next lectures about what to do about it. Okay? We have like 2 or 3 minutes. If somebody has some questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Well, if not, I'll see you tomorrow. I should mention that Professor Singh has a copy of all these slides, and so they should be, hopefully they're available to you. So please do contact me if they're not. Okay, thank you. I'll see you next time.